Welcome to History, 3rd and 4th graders. We are on Chapter 15, the second part. It starts on page 145. I thought I'd read that to you today. Next week we'll read the last part of the chapter and do the test together. So on page 145, War Against the Colonies, Louis XIV saves New France. Up north of Massachusetts, the French colonies were also fighting the Native American enemies. The people of New France had done their best to be friends with the Native Americans nearby. Years before, Samuel Champlain had been careful to make friends with the nearest tribe, the Hurons. He gave them presents, slept and ate in their villages, and helped them fight against their enemies. But the Hurons suffered from this friendship. The French gave the Hurons presents, but they also passed along a terrible new disease called smallpox. The Hurons had never been near smallpox before, so their bodies couldn't recognize the germs and fight them off. They began to grow ill. Rashes spread across their faces. They had trouble breathing and swallowing. Over half of the Huron tribe died from smallpox. Another Native American tribe that lived nearby, the Iroquois, saw that the Hurons had become weak from illness. The Iroquois had always been more warlike than the Hurons, so Iroquois armies invaded Huron land, burned Huron camps and longhouses, and killed hundreds of Huron men and women. The Huron tribe disintegrated, and the triumphant Iroquois claimed their land. Then the Iroquois set out to destroy New France because the French had been friends and allies of the Hurons. Small parties of Iroquois warriors raided farms in Quebec, burning houses and killing settlers. Other war bands laid siege to Montreal, the largest settlement in New France. The settlers fought back, but the fierce and determined Iroquois were experts at forced fighting. They appeared and disappeared with bewildering speed, leaving death and destruction behind them. Turn the page. The attacks went on and on. More and more French settlers left the dangerous lands of New France and went home. The colony shrank until it had almost disappeared. But then the King of France, Louis XIV, stepped in to rescue New France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, you might remember we read about him before, had spent years fighting wars to expand his French empire. He didn't intend to lose his colonies in the New World. So he sent soldiers from the French army over to fight the Iroquois. He promised these soldiers that he would give them land in the New World if they would save New France. The French soldiers sailed to New France and marched off their ship ready to fight. They had muskets and cannons. They had already fought bloody wars on the battlefields of Europe, and they were sure that they could defeat the savages of North America. They were wrong. The battlefields of Europe hadn't prepared them to fight in thick woods and tangled brush. Even with their bullets and cannonballs, the French soldiers weren't able to defeat the Iroquois nation. But they did manage to protect the settlements of New France from attack. Finally, the Iroquois agreed to observe an uneasy peace. They retreated back to their own land, and the French soldiers settled down on their new land, ready to begin new lives. Now they were faced with a different problem. Louis XIV had sent hundreds of soldiers, all men, to New France. These soldiers wanted to start families and raise lots of little French Canadians. But there were 6 men for every woman in New France. Once more, Louis XIV came to the rescue. He announced that he would pay young French women large amounts of money if they would go and live in the colonies. Many young women accepted the king's offer and sailed across the Atlantic to New France, where they were greeted with great joy by French soldiers looking for wives. These young women became known as filles de Roy, or Daughters of the King. Now that New France was a safer place to live, the colony began to grow once again. Farmers called habitants cultivated the fields of the New World. Fur traders called voyageurs sailed up and down the river trading for furs. Ships from France came to the ports of New France bringing French goods, newspapers, and more settlers. The towns of Quebec and Montreal grew larger and richer. The streets were laid with cobbles. Stone houses stood proudly in the middle of each town. Silversmiths, wig makers, and tailors worked hard on their crafts. The gentlemen and ladies of New France, like the courtiers of Louis XIV over in France, decked themselves in silk, lace, powdered wigs, and jewelry. But the Iroquois had not given up. Once again, they began to attack the rich towns and farms of New France. One October morning, the farm of Francois Jarret lay peacefully under the mellow fall sun. Francois Jarret was a seigneur, an army officer who had been rewarded with a large farm. Jarret's farm was called Vercheres. Many farmers lived on the lands of Vercheres, cultivating Jarret's fields for him. On this particular morning, Francois Jarret and his wife were both away from the fort, tending to business in the nearby town. Their 14-year-old daughter, Marie Madeleine, was walking through the fields. She could just see the fort in the distance. Birds sang in the trees nearby, and the cool fall air moved against her face. Suddenly, Marie Madeleine heard gunshots in the distance. Then she heard a terrifying sound, the voices of farmers screaming, "Save yourselves! The Iroquois are attacking!" She turned and saw a band of 50 Iroquois warriors charging towards her. She ran toward the fort as fast as she could. Later, Madeleine wrote down the events of that day. This is a simpler version of her story. The Iroquois who were chasing me found that I was too far ahead of them to capture, so they started to shoot at me. Bullets whizzed by me. As soon as I came close enough for the guards inside the fort to hear me, I started shouting, "Get your weapons! Please come and save me!" But no one appeared at the walls. Just as I reached the gate, the fastest warrior caught me by the handkerchief around my neck. I yanked it off, leaving it in his hand, slipped through the gate, and pushed it closed. I looked around me. There were a few gaps in the walls of the fort. I started shouting at the others inside the fort, "Put posts against the gaps! Repair the walls!" I grabbed one of the posts myself and put it into place. When the others saw me carrying a post, they began to fix the walls themselves. So I went to find the guards. I found one hiding. Another was inside the room where the ammunition and powder was kept. He was holding a lighted fuse. "What are you doing?" I shouted. He answered, "It's hopeless. We should blow ourselves up so that the Iroquois can't capture us." "Miserable man," I screamed, "give me that." He gave me the fuse. I could see that no one else would lead us, so I took off my bonnet, put on a hat, and grabbed a gun. I found my two little brothers who were 12 and 10. "Come on," I said, "let's fight to the death for our country." We loaded the cannons and shot them from the walls. The Iroquois were frightened by this and fell back a little. Inside the fort, women were crying. I ordered them to be shut in an inside room so that our enemies would not know that we were frightened. The sun was setting. The sky was filling with clouds. Snow and ice had begun to fall. I knew that the enemy would attack as soon as the night grew dark. All night we stood on the walls, guarding the fort against the invaders. I took one corner. My two brothers took two more. The last corner was guarded by a man of 80 years old. For 8 days we held the fort against our enemy. Finally, French soldiers from a nearby settlement arrived and drove off the attackers. For her bravery, Marie Madeleine de Vercheres became a French-Canadian heroine. Her statue still stands in Quebec today. And that is the end of our part 2 of our history lesson. We'll continue with part 3 next time. See you then.